XR 会議2020にご参加いただきありがとうございます。 XR 会議2020はダイヤモンドスポンサーシンク&センスほかスポンサー各社の提供でお送りしています。セッション開始まで今しばらくお待ちください。まもなく次のセッションが始まります。コメントは配信画面右のコメント欄からお寄せください。また、スクリーンショットや SNS の投稿に関しては、サイト上部の記載をご確認ください。時間となりましたのでセッションを始めます。コメントは配信画面右のコメント欄からお寄せください。スクリーンショットや SNS の投稿に関してはサイト上部の記載をご確認ください。それではどうぞ。
Hello, and welcome to my presentation on XR in 2020 and beyond, where we're going to look at some of the data that I consider most relevant into understanding the health of the VR and AR ecosystem. My name is Tipatat Chennavasin. I am co-founder and general partner of the Venture Reality Fund. We're the largest independent venture fund focused on virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence. We're a $50 million fund based in Silicon Valley and investing globally. And we focus on seed and Series A early stage investing. I have an undergraduate degree from Stanford University with a specialty in human-computer interaction. And I've spent most of my career as a VR, AR, and game developer. I've now been investing and advising in VR, AR, and AI startups for the past 5 years. And during that time, looked at over 5,000 startups in the VR and AR ecosystem and invested in 37, including the makers of some of the biggest, most successful VR games like Beat Saber, Job Simulator, Rec Room, and others. I'm also a speaker at many of these types of VR and AR conferences, and I'm a mentor for VR and AR incubator and accelerator programs worldwide, including the Tokyo XR Startups Program, which is based here in Japan. Thank you again for having me. It is an honor to be able to speak with you and share some of the insights that I've been seeing in the industry. And I hope after this presentation that you will be as excited for the VR AR ecosystem as I am. So when we talk about what is the VR and AR ecosystem, specifically for VR, people always want to know, how many headsets are there? What's the install base? And for us, it's very important to focus on just 6 degrees of freedom VR. That means 6 degrees of freedom head and hand tracking. This will exclude earlier mobile VR or 3DOF VR, and this really represents PC VR, console VR, and the new all-in-one Oculus Quest and other devices of that quality. And for us, that is the standard minimum bar for quality VR, where we see consumers spending and developers making real money. And unfortunately, it's really hard to get hardware data. So only Sony has been forthcoming. Earlier this year at CES, Sony announced that they had sold 5 million PSVR in about 3 years' time. Now, for PC VR, we're able to get some data by looking at things like the Steam survey, which shows how many headsets are connected. And we can see this data over time. And this represents pretty much almost like monthly active users. But then, of course, we can kind of map that out into how many actual devices have been sold. And we estimate roughly at this point 6 million PC VR headsets have been sold. And this is across the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, the Valve Index, and then the Microsoft MR series of headsets. And lastly, unfortunately, Oculus, who is one of the biggest players in the VR space, they've never actually shared any hardware data. But they have talked a little bit about the Quest, which launched May 2019, and and has consistently said that Facebook is selling as fast as they can make them. And then more recently, with the Quest 2 announcement, they mentioned that the Quest 2 pre-orders are 5 times the original Quest. And so because of that, we can see that there's a very robust VR ecosystem that's being established. But again, we're still talking, 10 to tens of millions of devices. And a lot of people will argue that still seems like, VR is in its infancy. But what's really important to understand is, especially as we're talking about a new platform, it's not just how much hardware is being sold, how many devices are being sold, but how much software revenue that enables, how much consumers are spending buying, especially third-party software, developers, supporting developers, and really creating a robust ecosystem. I'll give you an example. So when we're thinking about what's the next platform after mobile phones, the possibilities potentially, 5 years ago were VR or It could have been smartwatches, like the Apple Watch, or it could be smart speakers, like the Amazon Alexa. So 5 years later, we can see, smartwatches, specifically the Apple Watch, has sold 100 million devices. And smart speakers, they've sold hundreds of millions of devices. But I do not know of any developers, third-party developers, that are building apps for either of those devices and have generated over $1 million in revenue. So for me, those devices, hugely successful products for Apple and for Amazon and for Google, but they haven't become platforms. VR, we're actually having the opposite, where it's a much smaller footprint of devices, but the revenue potential, especially for indie developers, is quite enormous. And I will show you that with the next dive into software sales. So because of our position at the VR Fund, we've invested in several successful game studios, like I mentioned, but are also friendly with lots of other game studios. And they're able to share some data with me that gives me the ability to understand how many reviews and ratings turn into downloads and sales and revenue. And because of that, I've been able to map out revenue over time across the different app stores for VR. And this represents the Oculus Quest and the Oculus Rift stores, the Steam VR, or Steam, which represents PC VR headsets, and then the PlayStation Network, which represents the PlayStation VR software sales. And I'm only looking at VR-only titles. So not titles that are hybrid, that can be played without VR, but then can also be played with VR. These are titles specifically just that only work for VR. And what we've tracked over time, and we can see, in the first couple of years, it was a pretty small footprint and it's pretty small revenue, but it grew over time. But then what's really interesting was that 2019 was an inflection point. And you can see a big spike where revenue went from 100 million to 300 million, or 3x in 1 year. And if we look at the data, the two biggest reasons, one was the success of a game, Beat Saber, that was released at the end of 2018, and then it sold really well across the 5 million PSVR users. And then the other big part was the launch of the Oculus Quest. And we could see that the Oculus Quest already did 50 million in revenue, which was huge. Again, almost as much as the full revenue in 2017 across all the platforms. And so the launch of the Oculus Quest was so important to the current success that we're seeing in VR. Now, what does the 2020 data look like? And you can see when we look at the 2020 data, we've seen growth. It's not as big as the growth, huge of a spike that we saw as 2019. And two big reasons. One is the decline of the PlayStation VR, really because it was kind of seeing end of life as we're shifting to the PlayStation 5, and that there are no real big new titles that were released for the PlayStation VR that were hugely successful. And we kind of saw this, a lot of people really saving their money and focusing on the next generation of PlayStation console. But then the other big reason was that actually COVID limited, or maybe not just COVID, but also VR headsets, the newest VR headsets, specifically the Quest and the Valve Index, were in limited availability all throughout 2020. And that really slowed down some of the potential software growth. But I don't want to downplay it, because again, we saw huge hits that really grew, like PC VR revenue more than doubled because of a huge hit called Half-Life Alyx. And again, we saw Quest revenue, even though they were hard to get a lot of Quests, we saw Quest revenues more than double almost triple in this time. And what's really interesting is now we have about $400 million in revenue in 2020. And again, this is approximate because we're not done with 2020 yet. We still have December, which tends to be the largest year. But this 400 million number is really interesting because the total revenue of the VR ecosystem since 2016 is about 880 million. And so nearly half of the total revenue of the VR ecosystem was made last year. And again, going back to that $1 million milestone, we've seen over 100 titles have done over $1 million in revenue. And more importantly, on the Quest, which is a brand new platform that's been around for, again, a little over a year, we saw over 40 titles have done $1 million on the Quest. Now, to put that in perspective, recently Sensor Tower released some data, and they said that iOS developers that 98% of iOS developers don't make over $1 million a year in the iOS App Store against a billion iPhones out there. And what you could say is here, 40 titles, and I think there's roughly 200 titles on the in the Quest store. So about 20% of Quest developers made over $1 million in revenue in about a year, or a little over a year, which is phenomenal. And again, not just in the Quest ecosystem, but in the entire ecosystem, we've now seen over 10 titles that have made over $10 million in revenue lifetime sales. And that we're seeing top VR titles that can easily make $20-40 million in just 1 year. And to me, the biggest surprise was that a top title in VR can already reach a lifetime revenue of $100 million. That's incredible. Again, consumer VR has not been around for very long. It's about, a little over 4 years now. And we see a VR software studio can sell enough copies of their game to reach over $100 million in lifetime revenue. That's pretty phenomenal, if you ask me. Now, I want to kind of dig in a little bit on the Oculus Quest and its success and what that means for the ecosystem. I mean, this is clearly the way that the consumer VR market is going mainstream. And we're talking about an all-in-one 6-DoF device that, of course, you can connect to the PC, but the data suggests most people play it all-in-one standalone. So Oculus 2, or the Oculus Quest 2, I'm sorry, is higher resolution, faster performance, it's lighter and smaller, and it has a worldwide launch in October of this year, and is also $100 cheaper than the original Oculus Quest. It's phenomenal. And what's great about it too is that Oculus has done a very good job of figuring out the supply chain to make sure that there are enough Oculus Quest 2s available for anyone that wants them. And already Oculus had mentioned they saw 5 times the amount of pre-orders for the Quest 2 over the Quest 1. And now it's been available for about 2 months. We're seeing software developers talk about 3 to 10x software sales since the launch of the Quest 2. This really shows that Facebook is doubling down, really pull out all stops to own this ecosystem. What's really interesting is, again, the Oculus Quest was the best device by far. No one else has as high quality and as low cost an all-in-one device as the Quest 1. And then for them to actually make something better and $100 cheaper is just, again, showing Facebook is really in it to win it. And, just to compare what the Quest ecosystem really means, looking at about in 1 year's time, the Quest generated over $100 million in software revenue. Now, is that a lot? Well, we look at the PSVR, and it did about 110 million in software revenue in 2019. And that was with a 5 million install base. And it took them 3 years to get to 110 million in yearly revenue. So you could see how powerful and how fast the Quest adoption is compared to what we've seen in the past. So really, again, this is a very important milestone to understand, again, what Quest represents, what the all-in-one represents for consumer VR, and what the Quest 2 represents. And it's interesting, a lot of people like to compare the VR to cell phones, and that the original VR headsets that launched in 2016 were very comparable to the old Motorola brick phones. And we like to say that, the Quest represents maybe not the iPhone moment, but potentially, either the Nokia candy bar moment or the Motorola Razr moment, flip phone moment, where we're going to see mainstream adoption and we're going to get past, single digit millions of sales of one device to potentially, tens of millions of sales of this platform. And like we see down there too, that revenue could represent, potentially billions of dollars in software sales. So now let's actually dive a little deeper into what are the top VR games? Who's making money in this, early VR ecosystem? And so this is a ranked list of the highest grossing VR games, and this is based off lifetime sales. And so there's a lot of interesting things to look at or to take from this. The most important thing is that indies are on top. There's 2 AAA games here, Half-Life Alyx and Skyrim VR. And the rest are all indies. Oh, and I forgot to mention that this list represents VR titles that we estimate have made over $10 million in lifetime sales. And so what's really, interesting about that is, when we think about emerging platforms, when we think about the shift from, regular gaming to social gaming, or from, regular gaming to mobile gaming, it was always an opportunity for new indie developers to come compete against the AAA studios that no longer had the unfair advantage of the older platforms that they've built over time, and really succeed in a big way and potentially grow up to be a AAA studio, or most likely get acquired by AAA studios. But we're seeing that happen again with VR. We're seeing tiny teams with small budgets get huge returns. And again, a lot of these titles that you see here had initial budgets of $1 million or less, with little to nothing spent on marketing. So to have these titles return $10 million, or in some cases a lot more, is really incredible. The other thing to notice, most of these titles are multi-platform, although there are a couple standouts that are PC only. It's a pretty actual, if you look at it, it does look at first like there's a lot of first-person shooters, but there's actually a lot of pretty good diversity. There's family casual gaming, there's puzzle gaming, there's music rhythm gaming, there's horror, fantasy action, even 3D platformers or third-person platformers, and RPGs. So it's a pretty good mix that's very encouraging. It hasn't, that kind of also represents how early of a stage it is, where we haven't really solidified what game, works and what everyone's trying to copy. It's also a mostly new IP, which is also very important in a new platform cycle. And most important is that they're almost all like native for VR, or recreated from the ground up for VR interactions. And I think the most astonishing or incredible thing is that 3 of these games were initially made by teams of 3 people or less. So Beat Saber was originally developed by a team of 3. And then both Onward and Blade and Sorcery were originally developed by 1 full-time dev with some part-time assistants. But really, to think and to see what's possible now. Like, if you look at the mobile ecosystem or Steam ecosystem, very few games are made with this small budget or these small teams and have these kinds of returns. I think I read somewhere else that the average Steam game makes $60,000 in its first year. And so again, if we look at what's going on in VR, it's probably the biggest opportunity for indie developers, teams with $1 million or less budgets, or $5 million or less budgets, to get some kind of good result from all of their effort. And it's interesting because on mobile right now, you can't even market a game for less than $1 million a month in user acquisition spend. And that's the price or the potential cost of development and launching of a VR title, which, if done right, can give you pretty big returns on that investment. So I honestly think that right now for independent game developers, VR is the biggest opportunity. But it's not just about gaming. We're seeing VR go mainstream for a lot of other entertainment as well. COVID has really kind of shut down a lot of the traditional entertainment, especially concerts, film, going to the movies, festivals, all of these activities that we used to do, especially that we used to do socially with big crowds, specifically in the US. I mean, I know now in parts of Asia, these things are starting to be possible again, but in places that are hit hardest by COVID, like the US or, parts of Europe, concerts and all these things, at the soonest might open up again next year with when enough of the population has been vaccinated. But during this time, virtual concerts and events have really gone mainstream. VR allowed for people to be social during COVID. In particular with virtual concerts, we saw 45.8 million views in Fortnite for Travis Scott, 33 million views in Roblox for Lil Nas X. Now, I know in Japan, there have been virtual concerts for years now. A lot of these are live events, and it has hundreds, maybe thousands of viewers. But in the US now, I mean, especially because they're not necessarily in VR, people are watching these virtual concerts, not in VR, but like on a regular iPhone or watching it on Twitch and playing it on their consoles. But they're seeing these virtual concerts with virtual avatars, interacting with friends, enjoying them, spending money on avatars or avatar items that are related to the concert. And you can really see how this opportunity of virtual concerts is really becoming bigger and bigger. And we're also seeing things like film festivals, like the Venice Film Festival, TIFF, Raindance, others use fully immersive VR, like VR Chat or Museum of Other Realities, to host their immersive portions, allowing actually way more people to experience these film festivals than who would actually do it in real life. And it's been pretty phenomenal. I got to attend, several of these in real life, and I actually prefer visiting them in VR because you don't have to wait in line. You can go to events where there's still panels and sessions where you can hear from the creators, but then you can actually mingle with them and interact with them more often as well. And, you can all do this from the comfort of your own home. And so it's been really, really interesting to kind of see how this is adapted. And we think moving forward, more of them will do this kind of VR portion, even when we go back to face-to-face and in real life. And I think another great example of this is Burning Man, which is one of the biggest cultural events in the US. And it's a huge kind of art festival, lifestyle festival. And this year, because we couldn't do it in real life, It went virtual using a program called AltSpace, where people could do it in VR or outside of VR. And this brought a lot of mainstream attention to this idea of social VR and social interaction. And surprisingly, almost all of the reviews were super positive. And again, this idea of more people are now doing VR than have ever, and are experiencing social VR, interacting with other people. I think Burning Man typically has like 80,000 people go to attend the event during that week-long event. And definitely the virtual burn had way more people attending and interacting. And so it's kind of great to see that VR has really been highlighted during this tough time and has been very effective in kind of showing the potential for connecting people and for giving people authentic experiences. Now, it's not just about it's not just about consumer. Honestly, COVID has accelerated VR and AR adoption in the enterprise in a very meaningful way. So, we saw a lot of companies where these things like training, remote collaboration, virtual design, they were nice to have, future of work. And when COVID, shut down offices and when people had to work remotely, all of a sudden they went from being nice to have to need to have, and need to have yesterday. And what's really interesting is, again, this converted a lot of companies that were in pilots. We saw them roll out bigger deployments of hundreds of HMDs, from anything from soft skills training to surgical training, especially in those areas where they had to do training that wasn't allowed anymore because of COVID. So either using certain facilities or meeting with large groups of people, training in certain ways was no longer possible. And now VR or AR would be the only option moving forward. That's where we saw the biggest adoption. And this translated to real revenue. We're now looking at dozens of companies making over $1 million in ARR, or annual recurring revenue. And that top VR and AR companies are doing over 10 million ARR. And that's incredible. Again, there's never been this many companies making this much money in the VR AR ecosystem, and really kind of showing the way. And diving down into the top use cases, like I mentioned, training. Striver is one of the leaders. They're training millions of people in Walmart, DHL, and other Fortune 500s. But there's other companies like Tailspin, Oso doing the surgical training, GibLib doing the surgical training. Companies like that again are providing solutions that keep the workforce ready, reskill the workforce for new jobs that are going to be needed, in this post-COVID world, and more. And it's really incredible to see. Also, I mentioned, remote collaboration. The Wall Street Journal gave really great coverage for using VR to avoid Zoom fatigue. And they highlighted a company called Spatial for their kind of virtual meeting, virtual brainstorming collaboration solution that works both for VR and AR headsets. But what's really interesting too is, it's not just about these virtual meetings, but it's about remote work together, and actually, not just communication, but productivity and collaboration. And one of our portfolio companies, actually, a company called Apprentice, they have a remote assistance, remote work solution for pharmaceutical laboratories. And they've been critical, essential during this time of COVID, and actually are active in helping to develop COVID vaccines, working with some of the biggest drug manufacturers in the world. And they've seen demand for their products increase 7x over previous years. Because again, it's gone from nice to have to need to have during these times. Another great example is for product design, and in particular, Ford, during this time is using an application called Gravity Sketch for car design, automobile manufacturing design. What's really interesting about this is, again, it's allowing their designers to work, to collaborate, to give feedback on designs all around the world, but virtually together at the same time, and work more efficiently and effective. And we've seen tools like this, allow things like, helicopter aviation design, which typically takes, anywhere from 3 to 5 years, to take months in terms of developing new concepts and new vehicles and product lines. And so again, you can see how VR and AR are showing, new ways of working that have become essential during COVID. And that again, once we have a vaccine, once things return to this quote unquote new normal, we're still talking about, I think, it depends by industry, but some say that travel will be reduced by 50%, and others are saying that there'll be 30% of the workforce will continue to work from home, even when things go back to normal. And so this is where these tools become essential. Now, I've talked a lot about VR. I do want to spend some time talking about some of the advancements that's happened in the mobile AR, because again, the most powerful device is the device that you have with you at all times, or the most useful device. This is the device that you have with you at all times. And, Apple has now officially launched LiDAR, or 3D depth sensing, in both their iPhone and iPad Pro models in 2020. And this is really amazing. This is a huge leap forward in terms of what's possible for mobile AR. Not only does it allow things like 3D scanning, better and potential 3D recognition, but this is going to speed up and improve the quality of the AR experiences, especially for things like object occlusion. And already Apple has mentioned that there are over 10,000 AR-enabled apps in the iOS App Store, created by over 7,000 developers. And they mentioned that many of these apps are shopping and home improvement apps, productivity apps, lifestyle apps, so not necessarily just entertainment and games. But speaking of games, Pokemon Go developer Niantic, who actually made more money during the pandemic than they ever have before, they recently announced something they call the Real World Platform, which is their AR cloud platform. And what that means is it's their digital twin or digital double of the world that will allow people to permanently add and share digital information connected to the real world. And this is something that, again, Niantic wants to make available to other developers, and is kind of showcasing Niantic's bigger vision to be more than just a game maker, but to really be an AR platform for developers. But right now, the biggest or the leader in mobile AR is Snap. So Snap says that over 170 million of their users are interacting with AR daily through the face lenses. And it's one of those things where, again, that's about, I think, 75% of their user base. And they've created over 1 million lenses in their application. And it's very compelling. It's one of those use cases that, I don't think a lot of us, when we thought about VR and AR, thought that this was going to be one of the huge opportunities, but it really has become that. And you can see that with the huge numbers of users. And now really the question is how to monetize and how to enable developers to monetize on this user behavior. But once you have that many users, then the rest should fall into place. The other big development is really about how quickly consumer AR glasses are coming to the market. Now, Facebook at its big developer conference for AR and VR this year announced that they have a partnership with Luxottica, where they're going to release a Ray-Ban branded smart glass in 2021. Unfortunately, there's very little information about this. There's no idea about what the capabilities are, although they did show an internal project. I believe it was called ARIA or Project ARIA that they're using to prototype and help them think about use cases of what AR could be by having their own employees kind of dog food and try out wearing glasses with world sensors around them and seeing what type of new user behavior can come from that. And obviously those learnings will roll into whatever the smart glass product is that they'll release next year. And this is something that's already, that they've already been testing internally this year. And also the Chinese AR company Nreal, they launched a consumer product in South Korea in 2020 and announced that they'll be launching in Japan soon and that there will be a US launch in 2021. And this is a device tethered to your phone, uses birdbath AR optics, but really does have computer vision and does kind of connect and put digital objects into the real world in a way that's more advanced than any of the smart glasses that have been in the market so far. And Amazon announced that the second generation Alexa glasses are going to be launching in Q4 of 2020. What's really interesting, also is that Google earlier this year acquired a company called North. And that was a smart glass company or a maker of consumer smart glasses. They released their product last year or the year before. And they're about to release the Gen 2 of their product, which was supposed to be much improved. And then Google stepped in and acquired them. But you can see between Facebook, Amazon, Google, and of course the persistent rumors about Apple and what they're going to do with their smart glass, that a lot of the biggest players in technology are really looking at this. And surprisingly, there'll be products coming to market sooner rather than later. Now, what about the far future? I think this is a good time to kind of stop and take a look and think about what we have today and where this is going tomorrow in terms of VR and AR devices. And so we could say that the current generation of VR HMDs was really enabled by smartphone technologies, right? Like the screen, the high resolution, low cost screens, the high quality, low cost sensors and cameras, the high performance, low power processors. All of this was really borrowed from the smartphone industry and then recombined to create something like the Quest, which really represents the pinnacle of this generation of VR. And it's an amazing device, but it's still the quote unquote brick on your face. And we want to get to the smaller, slimmer, lighter, more comfortable, wear all day device that we dream of. And this is actually an Oculus prototype design. And so when we look at this, the biggest help that we're going to have to get there is 5G. And so 5G really represents two things in my mind. That's higher bandwidth, which is important for richer content and will enable more like, e-commerce application opportunities. But the bigger or more impactful feature of 5G is the lower latency. Lower latency will allow us to push the computing off device, reducing form factor and reducing power consumption. And this, compute would now be in the cloud or in the edge cloud. And really, that's going to allow us to create this device where, again, we don't need a lot of processing. We don't need a lot of battery. And that's going to lighten it. That's going to make it, smarter, smaller, more comfortable. But of course, it's not just 5G. We're still going to need custom optics and new display technologies that will reduce the form factor, get the display closer to the eye, but still have a big field of view. And these are all things that are being worked on. And so these designs that, again, might have seemed like, 10 years away, I think are going to come much sooner because of what's possible. So really, that's my presentation. I want to thank you all. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm available at tipatat@thevrfund.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Tipatat. And I hope that after this presentation that you are excited for the future of VR and AR and looking forward to contributing to it and helping make sure that it's even brighter and better. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.